The German officers stared in shock toward the distant horizon. What they witnessed on the morning of June 6, 1944, seemed unthinkable, utterly contrary to everything they had been trained to expect. An endless armada of Allied ships filled the English Channel, stretching beyond sight. Above them, the sky thundered with waves of aircraft so numerous they dimmed the rising sun. Sunday. This was not the weak, divided America that Nazi propaganda had promised. This was something entirely different, an overwhelming display of industrial power beyond imagination. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, would file his assessment 2 weeks later. His 3,100-word report identified the main reason for the Allied triumph with chilling clarity: complete air supremacy. In just 60 hours, Allied pilots launched 29,000 sorties. Each day, over 2,000 planes swept the skies, bombing and strafing anything that moved, even single soldiers. Moving tanks in daylight across open ground had become suicidal. What Rundstedt saw that June morning was the tangible result of a colossal German miscalculation that had begun 3 years earlier. On the night of January 8th to 9th, 1942, Adolf Hitler sat in his headquarters delivering one of his rambling evening monologues. Heinrich Heim and Martin Bormann recorded his words for what would later be published as Hitler's Table Talk. The Führer spoke with absolute certainty about the United States. Everything about the behavior of American society shows it is half Judaized and half negrified, he declared. How can a nation like that hold together? A country where 80% of the income goes to the public purse, where everything revolves around the dollar. This was not mere rhetoric. It was the ideological core of Nazism, a belief that shaped German strategic thinking and ultimately led to the Reich's ruin. Hitler had voiced similar opinions 1 month earlier. On December 11, 1941, as he addressed the Reichstag to announce war on the United States, he sneered that whatever America produced without Europe's influence might impress a Jewified, mixed race, but Europe saw it as a symptom of cultural and artistic decay, a product of Jewish and Negro blood. The Nazi hierarchy truly believed these racial fantasies. They convinced themselves that diversity made nations weak, that Jewish influence rotted societies, that democracy rendered countries incapable of war. These weren't cynical lies for the German people. They were the genuine convictions guiding Nazi assessments of both their enemies and themselves. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a civilization in collapse. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, orchestrated this campaign relentlessly through his newspaper, Das Reich. On August 9, 1942, Goebbels mocked the U.S. as God's country, writing that left to its own devices it would soon return to wilderness, as barren and empty as the souls of its people. He portrayed America as culturally hollow, dependent on Europe for anything of worth, a youthful nation without heritage, refinement, or true intellect. Goebbels's contempt extended especially to American military leaders. In his June 7, 1942 essay, Heroes and Film Heroes, he derided General Douglas MacArthur as a coward for leaving Bataan before the surrender of April 10th, contrasting him with German General Scherer, whose men held out 107 days while surrounded. The fleeting glory of America's film heroes, he wrote, will melt away like wax in Madame Tussauds museum. Hermann Göring, as Reichsmarschall and head of the Luftwaffe, echoed this arrogance, famously claiming that Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades, not the tools of war. He insisted they lacked the industrial skill to ever challenge Germany. It was not empty boasting. It was what the Nazi elite sincerely believed. The same themes echoed endlessly. Racial mixing made America frail. Jewish control poisoned its leadership. Capitalism fractured its people. German caricatures depicted President Franklin Roosevelt with exaggerated Jewish features, suggesting he was a puppet of global conspirators. Nazi magazines portrayed American cities as cesspools of moral corruption, their culture ruined by jazz music, associated in Nazi thought with Black Americans. The message was simple and seductive to true believers. America had no single national soul, no racial purity to unite it. How could such a mongrel nation possibly confront the racially pure, ideologically unified German Reich? Wehrmacht officers believed it. The German public believed it. Even after America entered the war in December 1941, Nazi leaders remained convinced that the soft democracy would crumble before the hardened warriors of the Reich. German strategists studied U.S. performance in World War I and dismissed it. Yes, American troops had arrived in Europe in 1917–18, but they had needed extensive training from British and French officers before becoming effective. The U.S. Army of 1918 had fewer than 200,000 men before the draft. Surely not the foundation for a modern mechanized military. Hitler's private comments dripped with the same contempt. He ridiculed the idea that Americans could produce advanced weapons or disciplined forces, scoffing at what he saw as their obsession with comfort, cinema, and consumer goods. To him, a people addicted to leisure could never muster the spirit of total war. His worldview left no room for the possibility that a diverse democracy might possess strengths his racially pure dictatorship lacked. When Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he did so with a strange mixture of inevitability and disdain. He viewed the declaration as merely formalizing a state of war that Roosevelt had been waging covertly for months through Lend-Lease aid to Britain and aggressive naval patrols in the Atlantic. But Hitler's calculus was fundamentally flawed. He assumed that America, already committed to war with Japan in the Pacific, would be unable to mount significant operations in Europe for years. By that time, he believed Germany would have secured victory over the Soviet Union and consolidated an impregnable fortress Europe. The German war planners made lists of everything America supposedly lacked: military tradition, professional officer corps, combat experience, modern armor, strategic bombers. The list went on and on. What the planners failed to understand was that America's weaknesses were temporary, while its strengths were structural and enormous. The United States possessed something Germany desperately needed, but could never have enough of: resources and industrial capacity on a continental scale. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, the Nazi leadership watched with growing unease as reports filtered back from North Africa. American soldiers, green and inexperienced, had initially stumbled. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm German superiority. Field Marshal Erwin RML's Africa Corps inflicted a devastating defeat on American forces in the Tunisian mountains. The casualty figures appeared to validate every Nazi stereotype. 6,300 American casualties, including 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. German forces suffered only 989 casualties, with 201 killed, 536 wounded, and 252 missing. American material losses were staggering. The tanks lost 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and 512 trucks destroyed or captured. German forces captured 57,000 gallons of gasoline and 45 tons of ammunition. German propaganda seized on Kasserine Pass as proof that American soldiers lacked fighting spirit. Nazi newspapers proclaimed that American troops broke and ran when faced with professional German soldiers. Radio broadcasts mocked American military competence. Goebbels declared that this was what happened when a mongrel nation tried to fight a war against warriors with pure blood and iron will. But experienced German officers noticed something troubling in the aftermath. RML himself recognized what Nazi propagandists chose to ignore. In his journal, he wrote that the tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. Later in the RML papers, he acknowledged even more. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. RML wrote, "Although we had to wait until the Pathan army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare, the Desert Fox, one of Germany's most capable commanders, had recognized something that Hitler and Goebbels refused to see. The Americans learned quickly. They adapted their tactics. And most alarming of all, their equipment was arriving in staggering quantities. By May 1943, just 3 months after Kasserine Pass, American forces had driven Axis armies completely from North Africa. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia. The lesson of Kasserine Pass was not American incompetence. It was American adaptability. The ability to learn from defeat, reorganize rapidly, and return stronger was precisely the kind of flexibility that authoritarian systems struggled to match. While Nazi propaganda continued to mock American industrial capacity, the reality unfolding across the Atlantic was staggering beyond comprehension. The numbers were so extreme that German intelligence officers who reported them were sometimes accused of exaggeration or defeatism. But the numbers were real, verified, and growing every month. In 1943 alone, America produced 29,497 tanks. This figure excluded other armored fighting vehicles. Total armored fighting vehicle production for 1943 reached 37,198 units. To provide perspective, Germany produced 26,925 tanks during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. America built more tanks in 1 year than Germany managed in 6 years of total war. The Sherman tank became a symbol of the gap between German perceptions and American reality. German tankers initially dismissed the Sherman as inferior to their Panzer Mark IV and the fearsome Tiger tanks. The Sherman had thinner armor, a less powerful gun, and caught fire more easily when hit. German crews nicknamed it the Ronson after a cigarette lighter because it supposedly lit up on the first strike. But when German forces captured a Sherman called War Daddy II from 1st Armored Division on February 22, 1943 in Tunisia, they shipped it to Kumdorf Weapon Testing Center for detailed evaluation. The German technical assessment contradicted the propaganda. The Sherman was well built, reliable, and comfortable. German engineers noted it was superior in reliability to German tanks, and described it as an automotive masterpiece the Germans could only dream of producing. What German tankers failed to appreciate was the strategic implication of American mass production. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, America was producing dozens of Shermans. Quality matters in individual tank duels, but quantity determines Wowin's campaigns. A Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out. But if America could field 20 Shermans for every Tiger, the mathematics of attrition favored the Allies overwhelmingly. German units actually sought out captured Shermans for their own use, particularly converting them to armored recovery vehicles. Tank recovery units in Italy preferred captured Shermans specifically because of their extraordinary reliability compared to German vehicles that broke down constantly. A German Africa Corps War Diary entry from November 2, 1942, noted that American-built tanks have an advantage over German tanks because they can successfully conduct a firefight at distances of over 1,000 kilometers. Aircraft production told an even more dramatic story. In 1943 alone, America produced 84,853 aircraft, including 9,574 heavy bombers, 7,256 medium bombers, and 23,621 fighters. By 1944, production peaked at 96,270 aircraft. This was more than Japan produced during the entire war, which totaled 76 320 aircraft from 1939 to 1945. American aircraft factories operated 3 shifts, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Women who had never worked in factories before learned to rivet aluminum, install hydraulic systems, and assemble complex instruments. By 1943, women comprised 65% of the aircraft industry workforce, up from 1% before the war. The iconic Rosie the Riveter represented hundreds of thousands of real women whose labor made American air superiority possible. The Ford Motor Company built a massive plant at Willow Run, Michigan, specifically designed to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. The factory sprawled across 3.5 million square ft, making it the largest single production facility under one roof in the world. At peak production, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers, including over 15,000 women. The B-24 Liberator was an extraordinarily complex machine. It contained 150,000 parts compared to approximately 15,000 parts in an automobile. Yet Ford's assembly line techniques adapted for aircraft production achieved mass production rates that military planners had considered impossible. At maximum production in 1944, Willow Run produced one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Peak monthly production reached 428 bombers in April 1944. Total Willow Run production reached 685 B-24s, representing nearly half of all B-24s built by all manufacturers combined. These bombers would pound German industrial capacity, destroy transportation networks, and establish the air superiority that would make D-Day possible. Ford workers building bombers at Willow Run were fighting the war as surely as pilots flying them over Europe. The Liberty Ship program exemplified American industrial innovation applied to naval construction. Initial Liberty ship construction took 230 to 355 days in 1941 through systematic improvement of mass production techniques pioneered by industrialist Henry Kaiser. Average construction time dropped to 30 to 42 days by 1943. The record holder SS Robert E. Peary launched in exactly 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes from Kiel, laying on November 8th to November 12th, 1942. While this was partially a propaganda achievement with significant fitting out work completed after launch, regular production still maintained extraordinary pace. By 1943, America launched 3 Liberty ships every single day. Total Liberty ship production reached 2,710 vessels from 1941 to 1945. These ships carried the supplies that kept Allied armies fighting. They transported tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, and the millions of tons of material necessary for modern warfare. German U-boat sank Allied merchant ships by the hundreds, but American shipyards replaced losses faster than submarines could sink them. Admiral Karl Donitz watched his strategy of starving Britain into submission collapse under the weight of American shipbuilding. The scale of American production extended across every category of military equipment. By 1944, the United States produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. More than half of all industrial production in the world occurred in the United States by war's end. American artillery particularly impressed German commanders who experienced it firsthand. RML wrote to his wife on February 18, 1943, during the Kasserine Pass battle, noting the effectiveness of American artillery. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone, he observed. German generals consistently noted that American artillery was more mobile, larger caliber, longer ranged, and better supplied than German equivalents. Once proximity fuses were deployed, American artillery became utterly devastating in effect. These fuses, developed in secret, used miniature radar to detonate shells at optimal height above ground, dramatically increasing lethality against infantry and unarmored vehicles. German soldiers learned to fear American artillery above almost any other weapon. The sheer volume of American shell production meant that American artillery could fire at rates German gunners could only dream of matching. The M1 Garand rifle gave individual American soldiers significant firepower advantages over German troops equipped with bolt-action KR-98K Mausers. While German units compensated with higher densities of machine guns and submachine guns, the semi-automatic M1 allowed American riflemen to maintain sustained fire rates impossible with bolt-action weapons. General George Patton famously called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Nazi ideology had insisted that American industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda, that American workers were too soft and undisciplined to match German production, that Jewish influence and racial mixing had corrupted American society beyond military effectiveness. Every single one of these assumptions was catastrophically wrong. American democracy, messy, contentious, proved more resilient and adaptable than German dictatorship. American mass production techniques developed for consumer goods translated brilliantly to weapons manufacture. American diversity, which Nazis viewed as fatal weakness, became a source of strength that Germany could not match. The proof lay not in propaganda, but in the diversity of Americans who built and wielded the arsenal of democracy. Every people Hitler dismissed as racial inferiors demonstrated capabilities that shattered Nazi racial theories completely. African-American soldiers whom Nazi propaganda portrayed as subhuman proved their courage and competence on battlefields across Europe. The Tuskegee Airmen shattered every racist assumption about Black Americans' capabilities. Of 992 pilots trained from 1941 to 1946, 150 deployed overseas, flying 1,578 combat missions and over 15,000 combat sorties. The Tuskegee Airmen destroyed 12 enemy aircraft in air combat, 150 on the ground, and damaged 148 more. Most remarkably, they lost only 27 bombers on escort missions, compared to an average of 46 for other P-51 groups. This was the lowest loss rate of any escort fighter group. Bomber crews specifically requested the Tuskegee Airmen as escorts because they knew these black pilots would protect them. The unit earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, and 744 Air Medals. 3 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action. 3 became prisoners of war, and 21 received the Distinguished Flying Cross. These were the men that Hitler's racial ideology insisted were incapable of mastering complex machinery or showing martial courage. Reality proved Hitler catastrophically wrong. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, attached to General George Patton's Third Army in October 1944. They fought 183 consecutive days in combat, participating in 4 major Allied campaigns. They breached the Siegfried Line, liberated over 30 towns, and were among the first American units to meet Soviet forces in Austria. The battalion suffered approaching 50% casualties, while inflicting an estimated 130,000 casualties on German forces. They earned 1 Medal of Honor awarded in 1997, 11 Silver Stars, and approximately 300 Purple Hearts, plus a Presidential Unit Citation awarded in 1978, 33 years after the war. Patton, who had expressed racist views earlier in his career, came to respect the Black Panthers' fighting ability and relied on them in critical operations. The 92nd Infantry Division, the only African-American infantry division in European combat, fielded approximately 15,000 officers and men fighting in Italy from October 1944 through May 1945. They suffered roughly 3,000 casualties, including over 400 killed, 1,500 wounded, and 500 missing or prisoners of war. The unit earned 2 Medals of Honor, both awarded in 1997, 5 decades after the war, 208 Silver Stars, 1,166 bronze stars, and 1,891 Purple Hearts. They liberated the Italian cities of La Spezia and Genoa. The Red Ball Express represented one of the most critical yet least celebrated contributions to Allied victory. This truck convoy system, 75% African-American drivers totaling approximately 23,000 personnel, transported 412,193 tons of supplies over 82 days from August 25 to November 16, 1944. They hauled supplies from Normandy beaches to rapidly advancing front lines. At peak operation, 6,000 trucks transported 12,500 tons daily. Drivers worked around the clock in shifts, maintaining momentum even when exhausted. General Patton called the 212-ton truck our most valuable weapon, acknowledging that his rapid advance across France depended entirely on this supply lifeline. Without the predominantly black drivers of the Red Ball Express, Patton's tanks would have run out of fuel and ammunition within days. Overall, approximately 1 million to 1.2 million African-Americans served in the armed forces during World War II out of 2.5 million registered for the draft. This included approximately 1 million in the United States Army, 167,000 in the Navy, 17,000 in the Marine Corps, and 4,000 African-American women in the WWII. These soldiers served in a segregated military, facing discrimination and prejudice even while fighting for their country. Yet, they served with distinction and courage, proving through action what Nazi racial ideology denied. They were not inferior. They were not incapable. They were Americans who loved their country and fought to defend it, even when that country did not yet grant them full equality. Jewish scientists fleeing Nazi persecution built the most devastating weapon in human history, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project's roster reads like a catalog of refugees from Hitler's racial policies. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the project. Leo Szilard co-authored Einstein's letter to President Roosevelt and conducted the first controlled nuclear chain reaction with Enrico Fermi. Albert Einstein's theories provided the theoretical foundation. Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, Felix Bloch, Otto Fr., Rudolf Peierls, Eugene Wiener, and Richard Feynman were among dozens of Jewish scientists whose brilliance Hitler had forced into exile. These men, whom Nazi ideology classified as subhuman parasites corrupting German society, developed the weapon that would make American victory absolute. A contemporary observer noted that the vast majority of the Manhattan Project scientists were Jewish, and almost all of them were German, Hungarian, or Austrian refugees fleeing Nazi racial policies. Nazi ideology literally drove the scientific talent that would develop the war's most decisive weapon into American hands. Hitler's racial theories had created his own worst nightmare: a Jewish scientific brain trust working for America. The final bitter irony was complete. Nazi Germany expelled the scientists who might have given them atomic weapons first. Those semestionists, welcomed by America's pluralistic society, built the bomb that ensured Hitler's regime would be utterly destroyed. Ideology divorced from reality had led Germany to arm its greatest enemy with its most talented minds. Native American code talkers provided unbreakable battlefield communications that baffled enemy intelligence throughout the war. Approximately 400 to 420 Navajo Marines developed and used a code based on their native language. Japanese cryptographers, among the world's best, never broke the Navajo code despite intensive efforts. They could not even identify what language was being spoken. At Aoima, 6 Navajo code talkers sent and received over 800 messages in the first 2 days of the battle, all without error. Major Howard Connor, signal officer at Iwoima, later stated bluntly that were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwoima. Beyond the Navajo, approximately 534 total Native American code talkers from 14 to 15 different tribes served in both European and Pacific theaters. 14 Comanche code talkers served in Europe and participated in the Normandy invasion. They provided secure communications during the Utah beach landing and subsequent operations, transmitting messages about German positions, troop movements, and tactical situations that could not be intercepted and decoded. Theory. Supposedly racially inferior Native Americans had created a communication system that the most sophisticated enemy intelligence could not crack. Japanese-American soldiers proved their loyalty and courage despite suffering the injustice of internment camps that imprisoned their families. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in United States military history. According to official Army designation, the statistics are extraordinary. 21 Medals of Honor, with 20 upgraded in 2001 original awarded during the war. 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts. Over 18,000 individual decorations total, from a unit that began with 4,000 men. The 442nd suffered a 314% casualty rate, meaning the unit had to be replaced more than 3 times over. From an original strength of 4,000 men, approximately 14,000 to 18,000 served in the 442nd during the war, with 680+ killed in action. The rescue of the lost battalion in October 1944 exemplifies their sacrifice. When 200 unwilling soldiers from the 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division were surrounded in the Vosges Mountains, the 442nd was ordered to break through German lines and rescue them. Over 5 days from October 26th to 30th, 1944, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties. More than 140 were killed, and over 600 wounded to rescue 201 trapped men. Company K was reduced to 17 riflemen. Company I was reduced to 8 riflemen. The unit received 5 Presidential Unit citations in 20 days for actions designated as one of the top 10 battles in United States Army history. These Japanese-American soldiers fought with extraordinary courage while their families were imprisoned behind barbed wire in internment camps in the American West. They fought not because they were treated fairly, but because they loved their country and wanted to prove their loyalty. Nazi racial ideology insisted that racial mixing and diversity made nations weak. The 442nd proved that loyalty and courage have nothing to do with racial purity. Hispanic Americans served in numbers disproportionate to their population. An estimated 400,000 to 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the military, despite constituting a smaller percentage of the total United States population. Company E of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Division, was an entirely Mexican-American unit from El Paso, Texas. Company E was among the first American troops to land in Italy at Segno. During the disastrous Rapido River crossing on January 20th to 22nd, 1944 of 154 men who crossed the river, only 27 returned. The unit was virtually destroyed, fighting at one of the war's most costly river crossings. Those who survived continued fighting at Monte Cassino and throughout the brutal Italian campaign, demonstrating courage and tenacity that matched any unit in the American Army. Women transformed American war production from an impossibility to reality. The female workforce increased from 27% in 1940 to 36 to 37% in 1945. Approximately 6 million women entered the workforce during the war years. In aircraft manufacturing, women comprised 65% of the industry workforce by 1943, up from 1% before the war. At Willow Run's B-24 bomber plant, up to 1/3 of the 42,000-person workforce were women. More than 15,000 female workers built the bombers that would pound German positions in Normandy and across occupied Europe. These women learned complex industrial skills, operated heavy machinery, read technical blueprints, and maintained quality control on weapons systems that required precision manufacturing. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol, but she represented real women with real skills doing essential work. They welded steel, assembled engines, installed electrical systems, and tested aircraft. They worked in shipyards, building Liberty ships and destroyers. They manufactured ammunition, assembled rifles, and packed parachutes. Without women workers, American industrial production could never have reached the levels that overwhelmed German capacity. American production did not only equip American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, America became the arsenal of democracy for all Allied nations. The scale of American aid to Britain and the Soviet Union demonstrated industrial capacity that German planners had insisted was impossible. Britain received over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to approximately $540 billion in current value. This included aircraft, tanks, trucks, food, raw materials, and industrial equipment. Without American supplies, Britain could not have continued the war after 1941. The Royal Air Force flew American-built aircraft. British soldiers drove American trucks. British civilians ate food shipped from America. British factories processed American raw materials into finished weapons. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to approximately $190 billion today, $49,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, enough to provide half a pound of food daily to every Soviet soldier for the entire war, 15 million pairs of boots, 13 million, and winter coats. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the final assault on Berlin, acknowledged after the war that without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything topple our artillery with. The Red Army's mobility in its great offensives from 1943 to 1945 depended heavily on American Studebaker trucks. Soviet factories focused on producing tanks and artillery, while American industry provided transport and logistics support. American industrial production supported not just American forces but the entire Allied war effort. Stalin himself, despite his complicated relationship with the West, admitted in a 1943 toast that without American production, the Allies would have lost the war. Even allowing for diplomatic exaggeration, the fundamental point remained valid. American industrial capacity was sustaining three major Allied powers simultaneously while also fighting a two-front war against Germany and Japan. German intelligence officers knew these numbers. They read reports of American production statistics and Lend-Lease shipments, but Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted the evidence. The numbers must be exaggerated, they reasoned. American production was supposedly inferior quality. Allied unity would crack under pressure. The Allies would eventually turn on each other, especially the capitalist democracies and the Communist Soviet Union. Every assumption proved wrong. American production numbers were not exaggerated, but actually understated in some categories. American equipment quality was generally excellent, often superior to German equivalents in reliability and ease of production. Allied unity held together despite tensions because all three major powers recognized that defeating Nazi Germany was essential to their survival. And the supposedly impossible feat of supplying multiple Allied nations while fielding massive American forces was accomplished through systematic industrial organization and logistical planning that German authorities had believed no day-to-day democracy could achieve. The German intelligence failure extended beyond the immediate invasion. Throughout 1943 and 1944, German military intelligence received accurate reports of American production capacity, force buildup in Britain, and invasion preparations. The numbers were available. The evidence was clear. But at every level of command, Nazi ideology filtered the interpretation of intelligence. Reports of American production were dismissed as Allied propaganda designed to intimidate Germany. When intelligence officers reported that America produced nearly 30,000 tanks in 1943 alone, senior commanders refused to believe it. That number exceeded total German production for the entire war. It must be exaggerated, they reasoned, or it must include training vehicles and obsolete equipment. It could not possibly represent genuine combat-capable armor. When reconnaissance flights photographed endless rows of Liberty ships in American ports, the photographs were analyzed, but the implications were dismissed. Yes, America built ships quickly, but surely they were poorly constructed, liable to break apart in rough seas. German naval intelligence knew better. They had captured American weapons and tested them carefully. Yet ideology outweighed evidence at the highest command levels where grand strategy was decided. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency, gathered detailed and often remarkably accurate information throughout the war. But Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who led the Abwehr, had grown increasingly disillusioned with Nazi leadership. His organization's intelligence was routinely ignored whenever it contradicted the regime's fixed assumptions about Allied capabilities. By 1944, valuable information that might have helped Germany counter Allied operations more effectively was being dismissed or twisted to match ideological bias. This refusal to accept reality was not unique to Nazi Germany, but in this case, its consequences were catastrophic. When a belief system teaches that racially diverse democracies cannot fight effectively, and the evidence shows them mobilizing unmatched industrial and military strength, a decision must be made. Either accept reality and adjust your worldview, or deny reality and cling to dogma. The Nazi hierarchy chose denial and paid for it with utter defeat. The Nazi racial creed proclaimed that diversity was weakness, that mixed races produced inferior soldiers, that Jewish influence decayed nations, and that women belonged only in domestic roles. The American experience disproved every one of these assumptions. The very diversity Nazis ridiculed became a decisive strategic strength that racially pure Nazi Germany could never replicate. Japanese Americans fluent in Japanese worked in military intelligence, translating intercepted communications and captured documents. Navajo Marines used their language to create an unbreakable code. Jewish refugee scientists designed the atomic bomb. African-American truck drivers kept Patton's army supplied with fuel and ammunition. Women built the aircraft, ships, and munitions that secured Allied air and naval dominance. Hispanic Americans fought bravely through the mountains of Italy. Native Americans transmitted secure tactical messages across battlefields. America's pluralistic society drew on a vast range of talents and experiences, advantages that Nazi ideology had deliberately excluded. Every Nazi racial doctrine turned into a military handicap. Every claim that diversity weakened a nation proved disastrously false. The so-called half-Judaized, half-negrified nation that Hitler mocked had become an industrial and military titan Germany could not hope to overcome. Even before D-Day, German forces had felt the weight of America's industrial power through the relentless strategic bombing campaign. Beginning in 1943, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators pounded German cities and production centers in daylight raids, while the Royal Air Force struck by night. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, expanded from a few squadrons in 1942 to more than 200,000 personnel and thousands of heavy bombers by 1944. On a single mission, over 1,000 bombers could take off, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustang fighters. Each aircraft carried up to 4 tons of explosives, meaning 1,000 bombers could drop 8 million pounds of bombs in a single day. German workers experienced American air power firsthand as factories vanished beneath waves of explosions. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the aircraft works at Regensburg, the vital synthetic fuel refineries. Raid after raid, month after month, American bomber crews paid a terrible price in lives. But the cumulative destruction crippled Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. By spring 1944, soldiers manning fortifications in Normandy could look skyward and see vast formations of American bombers heading east toward the Reich. Hundreds of silver aircraft glinting in the sun, bound to unleash destruction on German cities. Those same factories that built the bombers were now producing landing craft, tanks, and trucks for the coming invasion. The Luftwaffe, once dominant across Europe, had been exhausted by attrition. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained. Fuel shortages grounded many planes. Production could no longer replace losses. By the time of D-Day, the Luftwaffe was only a shadow of its former power, unable to challenge Allied air supremacy over France. German troops in Normandy knew exactly what Allied control of the skies meant. They had witnessed it in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had been hammered from above. They had seen it in Italy, where Allied fighter bombers shredded German convoys. And now they were living it in France, where Allied aircraft prowled freely, destroying anything that moved. The skies belonged to the Allies. Every soldier on the ground understood that. Every soldier on the ground understood that. By the spring of 1944, there was no longer any question whether the Allies would invade France, only where and when. German intelligence knew the invasion was imminent. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt disagreed on how to stop it, but both recognized that halting the enemy at the beaches was vital. If the Allies secured a foothold and broke into the French interior, Germany lacked the strength to push them back. Rommel urged that panzer divisions be stationed close to the coast for an immediate counterattack. Rundstedt favored holding armor in reserve to strike once the main landing point was identified. Either plan might have succeeded if Germany still controlled the air. But Rommel grasped a reality his colleagues were slow to accept. Under Allied air supremacy, any large-scale movement of tanks by day would be suicide. In his pre-invasion assessment, RML wrote prophetically about Allied air power. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. This was not pessimism, but realism. RML had experienced Allied air power in North Africa and knew what was coming. On June 5, 1944, weather forecasts predicted 2 weeks of conditions unsuitable for invasion. High winds, rough seas, and heavy clouds would make large-scale amphibious operations impossible. RML, believing the weather provided a window of safety, left France to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6th. Many German officers relaxed their vigilance, convinced that invasion was not imminent. German intelligence intercepted Allied code messages on June 1st and June 5th. The first 2 lines of Erlin's poem, Chanson d'Homme, had been identified by Admiral Canaris as the signal for invasion within 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Meir alerted 15th Army, telephoned Rammel's and von Rundstedt's headquarters, and teletyped General Jodl. The chain of command failed catastrophically. Jodl did nothing, assuming von Rundstedt was alerted. Von Rundstedt did nothing, assuming Rommel was alerted. RML either never received the warning or was focused on his wife's birthday. The 15th Army went on alert, but took no significant action. Other commands received no proper warning. The only German forces fully alerted to imminent invasion through intelligence that proved completely accurate failed to act because each level of command assumed someone else was handling it. But Allied meteorologists had identified a brief window of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower made the decision to go. The invasion was on. In the darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, over 23,000 Allied airborne troops dropped into Normandy or arrived by glider. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped over the Cotentin Peninsula behind Utah Beach. British and Canadian paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division secured the eastern flank near Caen. Their mission was to secure key bridges, disable coastal batteries, and disrupt German reinforcements. The airborne drops were scattered and chaotic. High winds and German anti-aircraft fire dispersed paratroopers across miles of Norman countryside. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed far from their designated zones and had to navigate enemy territory in darkness. Despite the chaos, small groups of paratroopers accomplished critical objectives, seizing bridges and blocking roads that would have allowed rapid German reinforcement of the beaches. At 0545, still before dawn, naval bombardment began. 84 warships, plus dozens of landing craft equipped with guns and rockets, opened fire on German coastal defenses. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thunder of explosions that shook the earth and shattered the pre-dawn darkness. USS Nevada, which had been damaged at Pearl Harbor and returned to service, fired 337 rounds of 14-inch shells and nearly 2,700 rounds from 5-inch guns at Utah Beach alone. HMS Belfast would fire over 4,006-inch shells over 33 days of support operations. HMS Ramillies fired over 1,000 shells from 15-inch main armament. By June 18th, German defenders in their fortifications experienced bombardment unlike anything they had encountered. Concrete bunkers shook and cracked. Communications lines were severed. Defensive positions were obliterated. At 6:30, the first assault waves hit the beaches. 132,715 seaborne troops would land on 5 beaches that day. The Americans assaulted Utah Beach on the Cottontan Peninsula and Omaha Beach between Verville and Seville. The British attacked Gold and Sword beaches. The Canadians landed on Juno Beach. Each beach presented unique challenges and different levels of resistance. Utah Beach proved the least costly. Strong currents pushed landing craft 2,000 miles south of the planned landing site, accidentally avoiding the heaviest German defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt, and at 56, the oldest man in the assault force, led the 4th Infantry Division ashore. When he realized they had landed in the wrong location, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Utah Beach casualties were remarkably light. Fewer than 200 killed wounded, or missing out of over 23,000 troops landed. The accidental landing location combined with effective naval gunfire support and the rapid advance of troops from the beach allowed American forces to quickly link up with paratroopers inland and secure the western flank of the invasion. Omaha Beach became the bloodiest and most difficult landing. German defenses at Omaha were more extensive than intelligence had predicted. The 352nd Infantry Division defending Omaha was a higher quality unit than most static coastal divisions. Cliffs overlooked the beach, providing German defenders with commanding fields of fire. Rough seas swamped many landing craft and tanks equipped with flotation devices. The first assault waves at Omaha suffered devastating casualties. German machine gun and artillery fire swept the beach. Men huddled behind beach obstacles and the sea-dew wall, pinned down and unable to advance. Landing craft continued bringing reinforcements into a killing zone. For several hours, it appeared the Omaha Beach assault might fail completely. Commanders offshore considered evacuating survivors and shifting follow-on waves to other beaches. But small groups of American soldiers led by junior officers and sergeants began advancing up the bluffs. Engineers cleared obstacles despite heavy casualties. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, sometimes grounding themselves to provide direct fire support. Slowly, painfully, American forces clawed their way off Omaha Beach and secured the heights overlooking the state landing area. By day's end, approximately 2,400 American casualties had been suffered at Omaha, but the beach was secured. The British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches faced varying levels of resistance. Gold Beach saw moderate opposition overcome by veteran British troops. Juno Beach presented difficult conditions with offshore reefs and strong defenses, but Canadian forces pushed inland rapidly once they cleared the beaches. Sword Beach, closest to Caen, faced determined German resistance, but British forces established a solid beachhead. Overhead, Allied air superiority was absolute and devastating. 11,590 Allied aircraft were available on D-Day, including 3,455 operational heavy bombers, 989 operational medium and light bombers, and 3,824 operational fighters. These aircraft flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day alone. For comparison, the Luftwaffe could field only 319 to 815 serviceable aircraft in all of Western France. The ratio was approximately 37 Allied sorties for every one German sortie. German pilots who attempted to interfere with the invasion were swarmed by Allied fighters. Luftwaffe fighter ace Joseph Priller famously made a single strafing run across Sword Beach, with his wingman in the only German air attack on the beaches that day. 2 aircraft against 11,590. German soldiers defending Normandy watched Allied aircraft fill the sky in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. They saw their own positions destroyed by dive bombers. They watched German reinforcements strafed and destroyed on roads leading to the front. They experienced what RML had predicted. Fighting with modern weapons against an enemy in complete command of the air meant fighting with the same handicaps savages faced against modern European troops. The total invasion force comprised 6,139 vessels. This included 1,213 naval combat ships, 4,126 landing ships and landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Naval personnel totaled 195,700 sailors from multiple Allied nations. By the end of D-Day, approximately 156,000 to 160,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. 73,000 Americans, 83,115 British and Canadian. German defenders had been overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of an operation that Nazi ideology had insisted was beyond Allied capability. Germany had nominally 58 divisions in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Approximately 850,000 troops spread over 2,000 mi of coastline. But quality varied dramatically. Many were static divisions lacking transport. About half included Ostbataillon, poor quality units formed from former Soviet prisoners of war pressed into German service. These were not the elite panzer and infantry divisions that had conquered France in 1940. Elchzweitwaffers Corps, commanded by General Erich Marx, directly faced all 5 invasion beaches with only 3 divisions, 2 of them static. When the invasion began, Marx understood immediately what was at stake. When ordering Colonel Hermann Vonapol-Bronikovsky to lead 21st Panzer Division's counterattack, Marx stated bluntly, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." The 21st Panzer Division represented the only German armored counterattack on D-Day itself. The division reached the Channel coast around 2,000 hours, splitting Juno and Sword beaches. For a brief moment, German tanks had reached the objective, but the division lacked infantry support and reinforcements to exploit its success. Massive Allied naval gunfire targeted any German movement. The sudden appearance of 250 Allied gliders overhead, threatening German rear areas, forced withdrawal by 2,100 hours. Hitler slept late on June 6th. Panzer reserves were not released until 1,500 hours, a critical 12-hour delay that allowed Allied forces to consolidate their beachheads. The divided command structure that RML and von Rundstedt had warned about paralyzed German response during the crucial first hours when rapid counterattack might have made a difference. When Chief of Staff General Hans Speidel telephoned RML with news of major Allied landings, RML repeatedly muttered while rushing back to Normandy, "How stupid of me! How stupid of me!" He arrived at La Roche-Con headquarters around 2,200 hours on June 6th. By then, 156,000 Allied troops had landed and established beachheads. It was already too late. By the end of June, 850,000 Allied troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles had crossed the Channel. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, and paralyzed by Allied air and naval superiority. Field Marshal von Rundstedt filed his formal 3,100-word assessment on June 20th, just 2 weeks after D-Day. His report identified the primary factor in Allied success with brutal honesty. The enemy's complete mastery in the air had rendered German defensive doctrine obsolete. Von Rundstedt noted that 29,000 Allied sorties were counted in 2.5 days, as deep as 65 km from the enemy bridgehead. Of these, about 2,300 aircraft a day dive bomb and strafe every movement on the ground, even a single soldier. Allied naval guns had made the movement of tanks by day in open country impossible. The enemy carries the battle right into the home battlefront with his tactical bombers. Von Rundstedt wrote to interrupt supplies and replacements and cause so many casualties in rolling stock and motorized columns that supply and replacements have become a very serious problem. By June 29th, von Rundstedt's frustration boiled over. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittler asked, "What shall we do?" von Rundstedt replied with shocking bluntness, "Make peace, you idiots! What else can you do?" He was dismissed July 4th, officially due to age and ill health. In reality, he had recognized what Hitler refused to accept. The war in the West was lost. Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to defeat the forces arrayed against it. In the weeks and months following D-Day, German military commanders continued filing reports that acknowledged their impossible situation. General Erich Marx, who had commanded LX-44 Corps, facing all 5 invasion beaches, was killed on June 12th by Allied air attack. He received posthumous oak leaves to his Knight's Cross for his role in containing the Allied invasion during the vital first week. Though containing was perhaps too generous a term for the desperate defensive battles that only delayed inevitable Allied victory, Field Marshal Win Rommel attempted to convince Hitler that the war in the West was lost and that Germany should seek peace before total destruction. On July 15, 1944, RML sent Hitler a personal letter stating that the situation on the Normandy front is growing worse every day and is rapidly approaching a crisis. The unequal struggle is approaching its end. 2 days later, on July 17th, RML's staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter. The attack left RML with severe head injuries that ended his active military service. On October 14, 1944, implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to commit suicide. The Desert Fox, who had recognized American capabilities early and whose tactical assessments proved consistently accurate, was destroyed by the regime he'd served. Von Rundstedt, dismissed in July for his make-peace comment, was actually brought back as Commander-in-Chief West in September 1944. Hitler had few other commanders with von Rundstedt's experience, and desperate times called for experienced leadership despite ideological unreliability. Von Rundstedt commanded during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, which ultimately failed due to the same factors that had doomed German efforts since D-Day: insufficient fuel, limited air support, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the evidence of American industrial might was undeniable, even to the most fanatical Nazi believers. American, British, and Soviet forces occupied Germany. German cities lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing. German industry was destroyed. The Wehrmacht was shattered. And everywhere German soldiers looked, they saw American equipment in quantities that made German wartime production appear microscopic by comparison. The transformation from Hitler's January 1942 dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-negrified to von Rundstedt's June 1944 Assessment of complete enemy mastery represented more than military defeat. It demonstrated how ideology, when divorced from empirical reality, produces catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Nazi leaders genuinely believed their racial theories. They convinced themselves that racial diversity weakened nations, that Jewish influence corrupted societies, that democracy made countries militarily impotent, that mass production of consumer goods could not translate to weapons manufacture. These were not cynical propaganda lies. They were core beliefs that shaped German strategic assessment. The evidence of American industrial capacity was available throughout 1942 and 1943. Germany possessed excellent intelligence services. They knew American production numbers, but Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted evidence. American production was dismissed as inferior quality. American soldiers were dismissed as poorly motivated. American society was dismissed as fundamentally divided and weak. Ideology functioned as a filter that made contradictory evidence invisible or unimportant. By June 6, 1944, reality could no longer be denied or reinterpreted when 156,000 troops landed from 6,039 ships under cover of 11,590 aircraft. When Allied naval guns made German tank movement suicidal, when Allied air superiority achieved ratios of 37-1, when American logistics transported 412,100 tons of supplies over 82 days to sustain rapid advance across France, the gap between Nazi ideology and empirical reality became unsurvivable. RML's pre-invasion prediction proved prophetically accurate. Allied air superiority exposed panzers to devastating fighter-bomber attacks, preventing their movement exactly as he had warned. The strategic debate between RML's armor at the coast strategy and von Rundstedt's armor in reserve strategy became irrelevant when Allied air and naval power made large-scale German armored counterattacks impossible regardless of positioning. The final bitter irony completed the circle of German self-destruction. The circle of German self-destruction. Nazi racial policies directly strengthened America while weakening Germany. Jewish scientists fleeing persecution built the Manhattan Project that would create atomic weapons. German military intelligence lost countless talented analysts and code reekers to racial purges. The SS diverted scarce military resources to genocide. Occupied territories that might have provided willing labor and even military recruits instead became sources of resistance and partisan warfare. Every principle of Nazi racial ideology translated into strategic disadvantage. Hitler's dismissal of America was not a random insult. It flowed logically from Nazi racial theory. That same theory predicted American collapse, industrial inadequacy, military incompetence, and societal fragmentation. American reality systematically falsified every prediction. The half-Juded and half-negrified nation that Hitler dismissed in January 1942 had become, by June 1944, the industrial and military power that German commanders recognized could no longer be defeated. The beaches of Normandy became the graveyard of Nazi illusions. There on the sand and in the surf, German defenders confronted the reality they had denied for so long. America was not weak. Its society was not fractured beyond recovery. Its industrial power was not propaganda, but frightening reality. And perhaps most important, the soldiers who came ashore that day. Soldiers from every American state and dozens of ethnic backgrounds fought with courage and determination that equaled anything German soldiers could muster. The German soldiers defending Normandy learned in the most terrible way that propaganda is a poor substitute for truth. The America they had been taught to despise and dismiss was, in fact, a colossus. The racial diversity they had been told made America weak had made it strong. The democracy they had been assured was chaotic and inefficient had proven itself capable of extraordinary organization and focus. The industrial capacity they had been promised was exaggerated, was, if anything, understated in intelligence reports that had seemed too extreme to believe. D-Day was not the end of the war. 11 months of brutal fighting remained before German surrender in Satyid, May 1945. German soldiers continued to fight with skill and courage. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The industrial and military might raid against Germany was simply too great. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The fortress of Europe had been entered. And the armies that came ashore in Normandy would not stop until they met Soviet forces in the heart of Berlin. Adolf Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-negrified stand as one of history's great miscalculations. Those words spoken with such certainty in January 1942 revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi ideology. The racial theories that animated the Third Reich prevented German leadership from understanding that strength comes from multiple sources: industrial capacity, technological innovation, social cohesion, moral purpose, and yes, diversity of talent and perspective. America possessed all these strengths. Nazi Germany, blinded by ideology, could not see them until it was too late. For 3 years, from December 1941, when Hitler declared war on America, to June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Nazi leadership had clung to the belief that America's supposed weaknesses would prevent it from playing a decisive role in Europe. Those 3 years allowed America to build the largest military force in its history, supported by the greatest industrial mobilization the world had ever seen. When that force finally arrived on the beaches of Normandy, it arrived with a power that German propaganda had insisted was impossible. The shock that German defenders experienced when they saw the Allied armada approaching Normandy was the shock of reality colliding with ideology. They had believed the propaganda about American weakness. They had accepted the comfortable lie that their racial superiority would guarantee victory. The thousands of ships and aircraft that filled sea and sky that June morning represented truth they could no longer deny. Von Rundstedt's advice to make peace, "You idiots," acknowledged the conclusion that evidence had been screaming since American. Production began ramping up in 1942. Nazi ideology had led Germany into a war it could not win against, an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. The supposedly weak and divided nation had mobilized power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could match. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Ideology divorced from reality. Beliefs maintained despite contradictory evidence. Strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. These produce catastrophic failure regardless of how sincerely held the beliefs may be. Nazi racial theory was not just morally abhorrent. It was strategically suicidal. It caused the German leadership to consistently underestimate their adversaries while exaggerating their own strength. The Americans, British, and Canadians who stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, were not superhuman warriors. They were ordinary men from free societies who had harnessed their industrial power, built vast military organizations, and summoned the courage to cross the Channel into the heart of German defenses. They came from every walk of life, every background, and every corner of their nations. Through victory, they proved what Nazi ideology had denied all along: that diversity is power, that democracy can wage and win a total war, and that free nations possess enduring advantages dictatorships can never duplicate. The German officers who gazed in stunned disbelief at the Allied armada that morning were witnessing the consequences of their leaders' self-deception. For 3 years, they had been assured that America was weak, divided, and incapable of sustained warfare. They had been promised that German superiority would triumph. Instead, they confronted an opponent wielding such vast material strength that German resistance was ultimately hopeless. 3 years after Hitler's scornful dismissal of a half-Judaized and half-Negro America, his own generals were urging him to seek peace because the war was already lost. The sheer magnitude of Allied industrial and military might that came ashore in Normandy shattered every Nazi assumption. Ideology had collided with reality. and reality prevailed. The tale of Nazi Germany's disastrous misjudgment of America endures as a timeless warning. To believe your own propaganda is to invite ruin. To ignore evidence that challenges your worldview is to court disaster. To underestimate an enemy out of arrogance or prejudice is to invite defeat. On that June morning in 1944, as German officers stared across the Channel at a horizon filled with ships and aircraft, they saw their entire world and everything they had believed collapsing beneath the overwhelming truth of American power.